Well, let's turn to our panel because the leading academic, Tariq Ramadan, who is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University, is here. Miriam Francois-Serra, a columnist at the New Statesman magazine, is also with us, and the PhD researcher working on Islamist movements. And Dr. Usama Hassan, an Islamic scholar and former jihadist fighter in Afghanistan, joins us here. He is now a senior researcher at the counter-extremism think tank, the Quilliam Foundation. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and you're going to be with us throughout this special programme. Just a quick word, first of all, on the results we have seen. It is 20 attacks a day with around 170 deaths. I mean, that gives you a snapshot of just the human cost here.
Yeah, certainly. These are going on in places of warfare. Syria and Iraq are caught in civil wars, whereas in Nigeria and the Horn of Africa, again, you have civil wars and insurgencies. I think one thing should be made very clear, that this is actually not jihad. You know, in Islam, jihad is inner and outer. The inner jihad is struggling against yourself. Outer jihad includes charity and social justice struggles, also includes military action in the last resort, warfare. These groups are involved in medieval warfare and tactics such as beheading prisoners because they reject the modern world in general. That's why they reject democracy and modern nation states, and they're fighting for this very medieval idea of a caliphate. I'll come to some of those
thoughts in a moment. Miriam, what do you make of just the basic data, the figures that show both the numbers, but 50% of those killed civilians, the vast majority Muslims?
Indeed. I would just sort of take issue, I think, with the categorization. I think to term this jihad obviously makes for great headlines and it makes for great discussions, but broadly speaking, it tends to obscure quite different phenomena that we're looking at. So Boko Haram is actually a very different group to Al-Shabaab, which is very different to Al-Qaeda. And ISIS has its specificities, and the emphasis really on the ideological aspect, I think, draws us away from the political factors, which tend to become then underestimated.
Well, we'll explore all of that in a moment, but Professor, just quickly, a response to the basic data that you have seen.
No, I think that once again, that what you are expecting from us, it's this condemnation and this violence. What we have now, these are groups that are using violence. And the point is that when I was hearing you right now is, if we want to be serious about what is happening and just to tackle the issue of violence and extremists, we need to be very clear on how we are tackling the issue. We have a problem of definition, we have a problem of categorization of the people, and we have a problem of the political issues. And there are many people and many trends that are responsible. I think that this confusion...
We'll chew all of that over in a moment, but Usama, to you first of all, I mentioned in the introduction, you were a jihadist, you travelled to Afghanistan. Why did you do that?
I was 19 and I was idealistic, I was naive looking back, and I was fighting to defend Muslims as I saw it in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion and the communist takeover, and was also fighting for an Islamic state and a kind of global Islamic revolution, which is why ideology is important, and these groups have the common ideology.
We hear a lot about...
However, the human cost is awful, as you referred to.
We hear a lot about radicalisation. I mean, you were 19, you were at Cambridge University. I mean, how do you go from Cambridge University to the foothills of Afghanistan? How did that happen? How did you get drawn in?
Well, it's simple. It is actually ideology. I was fighting for a cause. I saw it as a noble cause, a glorious cause, and parts of that were very well intentioned in terms of defending oppressed people, etc. And it's what motivates a lot of leaders of these groups. Many of the followers go for other reasons, but ideas, for somebody like me who is not aggressive and doesn't get into fights or wouldn't hurt a fly, literally, but are willing to fight and die for a greater cause.
Miriam, you've written, haven't you, that it's almost akin, not the same, but akin to youngsters looking at gangs and seeing them and thinking they're cool.
I think we underestimate the similarities between jihadism, as you've called it on the programme, and other forms of criminality. In other words, there are very similar reasons for the disaffection which draws people to countercultural movements, which is what this is in effect for Europeans that are being drawn to the conflicts. But I think there are differences between the motivations of individuals from the European context, and I think perhaps the ideological aspect is more salient to some extent, but the ideological component, I think, in the region is massively overstated. The group that calls itself IS or Daesh, and I would reject the term caliphate as accepting their narrative on this one, is not a particularly strong ideological group. It doesn't have a particularly strong narrative. It's not particularly innovative in its outlook. And I think it's much more important to focus on why we have this movement emerge in the region. It's a break-off from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it's at the conflict, it's at the intersection of two of the bloodiest civil conflicts of our time.
Professor, why do you think people are going? Because people have talked about poverty, people have talked about education. What do you think it is that is drawing people in?
No, I think that what we heard, it's important. There are many reasons. The first one is, and we have to be clear on that there is a religious understanding that we have to address, because there are mindsets that are understanding it's us versus them, and it's us against them, and it's us resisting to their oppression. This is based on specific religious narrative, and we have to tackle this, because we cannot just say it has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with the wrong understanding and something which is outside Islam. And by the way, it's not new. We had very, sects in the past, what we call al-Khawarij, for example, that were using an understanding of Islam. If you don't agree with us on our understanding of Islam or our understanding of politics, we have the right to kill you. Then the mindset is there. So there is one thing. The second thing is the political understanding that at the end, the West is not fair with the Muslims around the world. And this is one thing which is important. We have to condemn, but we also have to look at ourselves in the West, in the way we are dealing with some governments, with some trends that we are using them. No, that's a very important point. We cannot just undermine this by saying it's all, condemnation.
No, I understand that. Why do you think it is that more Muslims from Europe are going rather than, say, Americans? What is behind that?
Actually, this is nothing new. 20 years ago, at least 1,000 British Muslims went to fight in Bosnia during the Bosnian Civil War in defense of Bosnian Muslims who were facing genocide effectively, and many other thousands went from around Europe. So the European deployment is actually on a similar scale, despite all the restriction and war on terror. But one reason why there's fewer Americans, I believe American Muslims are more integrated. America is a different nation, it's an immigrant nation. People come from all over the world as immigrants and integrate there. In Europe, there are issues with Muslim integrating in Europe, partly because of a post-colonial legacy and the racism
so a difference there.
Which had existed in Europe.
Just a brief final question for now. When was the moment that you, there in Afghanistan, realised this is actually not the right way forward?
I actually thoroughly enjoyed my time in Afghanistan, and wanted to fight in Bosnia. But when the jihadist movement went towards terrorism and also started fighting each other, so in Afghanistan after 1992, when our Mujahideen leaders took Kabul, we thought there was going to be peace and harmony and a glorious Islamic state or caliphate, because that narrative is important to them. However, what happened next was a 4-year vicious civil war between the Mujahideen leaders, and that taught me that a lot of these people are fighting for power and money and influence, and not for the sake of God or religion or Islam.
Let's pause there for